Remember from learning about the characteristics of life that all living things need energy. Our main natural energy source is carbohydrates, specifically glucose. Plants can make their own glucose in a process called photosynthesis, where they absorb the energy from the sun and they can convert it into glucose. This happens inside of the cells of a leaf where they have a special organelle called chloroplast. If we zoom into a chloroplast, they have these green stacks of discs called thylakoids, and around the thylakoids is a jelly-like substance called the stroma. These two places are where photosynthesis happens, starting in the thylakoids, where sunlight is absorbed to kickstart the first step of photosynthesis called the light-dependent reaction. Remember, dependent means you have to have something. So this step only happens if there's sunlight. Light-dependent reactions also need water or H2O. That water goes into the thylakoid where it is split, and the oxygen goes back out into the air as oxygen gas, and the hydrogen atoms have a very special job of absorbing that energy from the sun. And they carry that energy out into the stroma where it's going to be used in the second step of photosynthesis. This step is called the light independent reaction or the Calvin cycle. Independent, which means it does not need light to happen. Now in this step, carbon dioxide comes in from the air and it is broken apart and combined with the hydrogens from the first step to make C6H12O6, also known as glucose. Now remember, those hydrogens were carrying energy from the sun, and that energy is now inside of this glucose. And glucose, since it's a carbohydrate, that means it is short-term energy. Our bodies are going to break down that energy and take it out because most organisms cannot use energy directly from the glucose. Instead, we have to remove it and put it into an energy carrier, and our main energy carrier is called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Now, it has that long name for a reason because it tells us the parts of the ATP. It has this base called adenine. It has 3 phosphates, tri means 3, and it also has this sugar in the middle called ribose. Now, ATP stores most of the glucose energy in that third phosphate, and to get that energy to use, it has to be removed, and ATP becomes a new molecule called ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. Di means 2. ADP is like a dead battery. It can be recharged every time we eat glucose. And to get that energy into the ATP, our bodies do a process called cellular respiration. Photosynthesis makes the high energy glucose. Cellular respiration breaks that energy from the glucose. And most organisms do this in a process called aerobic respiration. Aerobic sounds like air because this happens whenever your body has plenty of oxygen. And this process has 3 steps: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So to start off, glucose goes into our cells, into the cytoplasm, where it is broken down in the process glycolysis. And this step is anaerobic, which means it can happen with or without oxygen. After that glucose is broken down, if we have oxygen present in our cells, we move on to the Krebs cycle, which happens in the mitochondrial matrix, or that squiggly line in the middle of the mitochondria. This step breaks down glucose even more and makes carbon dioxide, which we exhale, and 2 ATP. What's left of our glucose moves on to the electron transport chain. This step takes all the energy from our glucose and puts it into the most ATP. And this happens in the outside membrane of our mitochondria. It makes water as a waste product and makes 32 to 34 ATP. Now, this whole process can be summarized into the equation for respiration, which says that glucose plus 6 oxygen are broken down and rearranged into 6 H2O plus 6 carbon dioxide. And all the energy that was in that glucose is now in 36 to 38 ATPs. And our body uses those ATPs for things like cell division to help our bodies grow and repair themselves, for muscle movement, for your brain to think, all that from one glucose. Now, sometimes if you're doing things like exercising, you may run short of oxygen, and your body is able to switch to a process called anaerobic respiration or fermentation. This happens when there's not enough oxygen present to do regular aerobic respiration. Think an like no oxygen. A or an in front of a word means without. This happens in our muscle cells in a process called lactic acid fermentation. Whenever you exercise and your muscles become sore, that's because you're doing lactic acid fermentation and it's building up in your muscles and making them sore. This is also done by bacteria, and we use lactic acid from bacteria to make things like yogurt and cheese. Other organisms, like plants and yeast, which is a fungus, do alcohol fermentation, and we use the alcohol from this process to make things like bread and alcoholic drinks. Now, anaerobic fermentation starts with glucose. Glycolysis still happens, and it always makes carbon dioxide into ATP. No matter what type of respiration you do, you're always making energy. Now, photosynthesis and cellular respiration are connected. You cannot have one without the other. And we can see that if we look at their equations. The products and reactants are opposites. The reactants of one are the products of the other. Remember, reactants are in, products are out. We can also see this represented in a picture like this, where a tree does photosynthesis and makes oxygen and glucose, which goes into a human for cellular respiration. That cellular respiration produces water and carbon dioxide, which goes back into the tree for photosynthesis. You may also see it represented like this using the organelles, the chloroplasts, to do photosynthesis, and the mitochondria doing cellular respiration. And it's a cycle and always connected. That means humans and other animals must have plants to do photosynthesis in order for us to survive. We have to have them to get oxygen and glucose because we cannot make those things ourselves. However, plants do not need us because they have chloroplasts and mitochondria. So that means they can make their own glucose in photosynthesis and break their own glucose in cellular respiration. They can make their own oxygen and their own carbon dioxide in cellular respiration. So they do not need us, but we must have them.